Hi, my name is Nietzsche, and this is Artist Vivendi, the Craft of Living. Welcome to another episode. After skipping 1 week, I'm back to this normal schedule of recording, and what a week it was. It was just crazy, right? This whole election thing happening, the anxiety involved with that, and who knows what's going to happen in the coming week. But this is a good time to kind of decompress, at least for me, and to share some of the things. Actually, one thing that is very important to me, I'm super excited about this episode because it will deal with Friedrich Nietzsche, who in a strange way has deeply impacted my life, and I want to share one aspect in which he has done so. But before I continue, I want to thank you once more for joining and listening, and I want to encourage you to hit the subscribe button. I don't really care so much about the numbers and how many people like it or dislike it. Well, everyone cares about this, of course. But, you know, the more people respond and engage and interact, the way this is kind of being more featured in the algorithm sort of section of YouTube, and people might pick up on the channel. And I would like some of these ideas to be in a wider circulation. The same applies to the podcast version itself. Just hit subscribe or write a comment, and I read all of these comments, I respond to them, or just send me an email or a message, and all of these links are provided in the episode notes, just both in the podcast section and also on YouTube. So I'm here, and perhaps just to start this conversation going, I wanted to perhaps recommend a few podcasts that have been quite important to me. I would like to recommend them to you, to check them out if you are not already subscribed to them. I like podcasts, as many people do. I listen to them while I do my chores, exercise. It's a good way for me to catch up on things for which I usually do not have enough time, spent reading, or even just dedicate specific time to listen to these things. So while I'm doing my activities, mowing the lawn and stuff like that, I like to listen to various podcasts. And let me recommend one of them first, and that is Deep Questions by Cal Newport. Cal has been very influential in my life. His books have been influential in my life. And as I mentioned before, when it comes to books, it's partially the content, obviously, the way they're written and what they're saying. I mean, the book itself, right? But also the timing, right? There's some books that have really strongly influenced me because I read them at a specific point in my life. Had I read them, let's say, 10 years before that, or even 5 years before that, I would say, good book, but it would not have had that kind of a significance for me. So that's how it was with Cal's book, Deep Work. I just read it at a particular moment in my life when his vision of like what deep work is vis-a-vis shallow work really touched me deeply, I have to say, and has helped me not just in the realm of productivity and work, but also in terms of prioritizing life matters in general. I highly, highly recommend Deep Work, the book itself, but also the podcast where Cal is answering questions from his readers on technology, work, and the deep life. He has a way of putting things in a very concrete and specific language, has great insights on these matters about technology and work and life, and I can't highly enough recommend him. As a matter of fact, I regularly try to channel my students towards picking up some of his material, check out his blog, which is still called Study Hacks, because that's how he started offering advice to students, college students, high school students on how to succeed in college without burning out. So that's how he started. But then he kind of branched out in some other topics and themes. Most recently, it is his book, Digital Minimalism, that came out. And if I understand correctly, he's bringing out another book on email and how we use email and how we communicate in work environments. So looking forward to that as well. So Deep Questions, check that one out. The second podcast that I would recommend is Hidden Brain. And Hidden Brain is this kind of great show where they deal with different matters of psychology and life matters, life issues, often branches into questions of morality and ethics, sometimes in the realm of productivity. A wonderful podcast. Check it out. You might like it very, very much. And then there's some other podcasts, such as Rich Roll's podcast. And, not all the episodes there are really relevant to me necessarily, because he is interviewing, sometimes he has some gurus in there, sometimes he has mostly athletes and high achievers in various domains of life. Also episodes on plant-based diet and just well-being in general. But I like listening to him. He's such a great interviewer, brings out like depth in his guests. And if I had a different life and if I had different possibilities, this is something that I would like to emulate, having these in-depth conversations with people. It's just phenomenal. It's very, very, very nice. His book also, Finding Ultra, his, quote-unquote conversion experience from a very sort of unfocused life, had some health issues. He came from a history of addiction, alcohol addiction, and then having this eureka moment, this moment of awakening where he just decided to change his life. And after that had these enormous, fantastic achievements by running, different endurance races, and just great podcasts. So these are the 3 podcasts that I would recommend, and just check them out and see if they work for you. And perhaps in the future, I might be able to share some additional ones. So now back to Nietzsche. But before I go to Nietzsche, let me say another comment first. Now that we find ourselves, in the wake of this endless election cycle that we were exposed to and that really monopolized our, consciousness, and just the way it's just unbelievable, all these issues going on. It is perhaps a good time to reflect on this idea of post-truth. As you might recall and might remember, post-truth was the word of the year, became the word of the year in 2016. And since then, many books have been written on this topic. One book that I highly recommend because it is not long, it is really accessible. It is written by McIntyre, sorry I forgot his first name right now, by McIntyre, simply called Post-Truth, again published by MIT Press, where he traces some of the contemporary epistemological nihilism and how we arrived at that spot and how that is being utilized by different actors in the contemporary culture. It's very nice, very, very good. And actually one of the topics, one of the chapters in the book deals with the question whether postmodernism has led or contributed to this current cultural situation in which people are simply, inundated on the one hand with information and completely not recipient or resistant to facts, I believe, on both sides of the political spectrum. So he deals with that. It's quite an interesting book. But that's an important topic. And as someone who has had his fair share of exposure to different postmodern thinkers, both as a student, as an educator, and I imagine most of you have been exposed to postmodernism in some variety. I have been told by many writers and thinkers, and I'm thinking about ranging from Rorty to some other popularizers, Richard Rorty and other popularizers of these ideas, that somehow the very idea of truth, capital truth, is a bad notion. And it is bad for epistemological reasons, and it is bad for sociological reasons. Epistemological reasons has to do with this idea that the whole idea that we can arrive in some sort of conception of objectivity or kind of Thomas Nagel's idea, the view from nowhere concept, right? That somehow we can arrive at that somehow we can ever arrive at a position where we can speak about truth in any sense of absoluteness. That whole idea needs to be abandoned, has to be just jettisoned, because truth is just something that doesn't exist, that it is impossible to arrive at. So sometimes it is more the criticism of the very conception of truth. I won't go now into all of these philosophical debates. And sometimes it has to do more with a kind of epistemic humility, the fact that we are just limited in the sense that we cannot arrive at any definite positions. So this is kind of this epistemological skepticism. But the critique of truth, capital T truth, also comes from I would say, sociological perspective. I don't mean sociological perspective, I mean sociological implications more, where then the very notion of truth is being associated with very deleterious effects. For instance, it operates on kind of binary thinking, truth and falsehood. It has this almost imperialistic quality to it. And by implication, then, this leads to violence and to exclusion, right? I have truth and exclude everyone else who thinks differently. And sometimes it is type of a verbal exclusion, and sometimes it has more kind of a sociological dimension to this. So this very idea then truth being produced and being manufactured that it is, to use perhaps Michel Foucault's categories here, inevitably is connected to some sort of exclusion or violence. So this is kind of the milieu in which I have grown up as a student, in certainly ideas that are percolating in the academia. And so the question is, what do we do with these insights in the context, in the light of current political and historical realities? What do we do with that? And so many people have then coming back to this question by McIntyre, whether these kind of skepticisms that have emerged in postmodernity, kind of epistemic skepticism and epistemological kind of skepticism about truth, and then the other one, kind of the sociological charge. What do we do with that in the face of current realities? And while I would be leery of connecting these things in any causal sense, I mean connecting these kind of postmodern notions or skepticism about truth with current expressions of them in a post-truth political environment. The current political environment actually is a good test case of what happens when no recourse to objectivity, criteria, or adjudication is available to people. When people are not interested in these kind of epistemological adjudications, what happens with that? And you can see that the fragmentation and tribalism and complete breakdown of communication is certainly one byproduct of that. And not surprisingly, therefore, many people, and McIntyre included in his book, have tried to reassert a type of realism, a type of way of thinking about truth that recognizes our limitations to arrive in some definite positions, or absolute positions, and yet recognizing at the same time that there has to be some judgmental rationality, as Roy Bhaskar refers to that, this idea of being able to recognize that there are better interpretation and worse interpretations. And of course, many people have tried to focus on the fact, well, yeah, of course, we have a lot of problems with truth, but on a daily basis, it is actually remarkable how many truth statements we can make. So instead of focusing on this nebulous idea of truth, let us focus on statements we are able to make. And I can tell you that I can make now a plethora of statements which are incontrovertible facts. I can show you, I can prove right now that I find myself in my house and not in the university. I can argue that I find myself in the US and not in Europe. I can tell you that my sweater, it could be, I don't know what the proper name of this particular navy blue is, but for sure it is not a yellow color. So when you start going and start talking about these things, you're actually surprised just how many truth statements we can make. And many people have tried to actually point our attention to that. But let me boomerang back to Nietzsche. Because Nietzsche is certainly this 19th century figure who has problematized the very idea of truth. And I have to say that Nietzsche really, as I said at the beginning, impacted me quite deeply. He helped me understand what it means to have a aesthetic revulsion against the Christian faith. This kind of aesthetics of unbelief, which is not based on certain necessarily scientific facts, but generally just finding religion and Christianity specifically ugly and unappealing, referring to it as a religion of castration. This is an expression from someone else, but viewing Christianity as this omnivorous empire that tries actually to dominate through simulation, prevarication, presenting itself as a religion of peace, but actually being very much about domination. And all of these different critiques that he has, that was very important for me to understand on the one hand why people actually end up, or why, not end up, but why people have such aversions towards the Christian faith and other faith expressions. It helped me relate to other people and to some of my own challenges with some of the tensions that I experience myself. So that was very important for me, this idea of the aesthetics of unbelief. But also in Nietzsche, Christianity has an adversary worthy his salt, right? Because it is in Nietzsche that we have this kind of photo negative of what Christianity stands for. And it is in his contempt, in his dripping cynicism and sarcasm and relentless attacks on faith that we actually can understand the radical nature of Christianity. Because one of the biggest problems in our contemporary culture is that people have a sense that they have already heard everything. Kind of the newness and the revolutionary radicality of the Christian faith is kind of lost in this post-Christian society, right? And so when you read someone like Nietzsche, he really alerts you, he is this sort of voice of paganism, 22nd century, 3rd century paganism that expressed its revulsion against this growing Christian sect. He very much is echoing those sentiments in a brilliant way. So in a very, very strange sense, I have to say, Nietzsche genuinely led to a new conversion in my life. I actually became a more dedicated believer as a result, paradoxically so, as a result of engaging Nietzsche. So, but I would not recommend him necessarily as being a form of conversion literature, because in most cases he has actually a very opposing effect. But I read him as someone who in some way basically doesn't get Christianity, because he's responding to kind of his context and specific types of the Christian faith on the one hand, and on the other hand, he is getting the scandal of the Christian faith. And so this ultimate juxtaposition of the Dionysius versus the crucified is really a clear binary that is presented, a fundamental option that is presented to us as two opposing philosophies of life. And in the context of an increasing paganization of certainly American culture, and in the light of the fact that Nietzsche is, really belongs to the 20th century and 21st century, it is important to grapple with him. But this is actually something that I hope to unpack a little bit in, not later, but in a different episode, this aesthetics of unbelief. But today I want to talk about his truth and his conception of truth, especially his notion of perspectivism, and connect it then with some of the themes in this channel, which I believe is quite important. So if you look at his opus, this notion of perspectivism, that truth is simply a matter of expressing opinion from a specific social or personal location, that was actually first articulated by him, or he first articulated that in 1878 in Human All Too Human. But his quintessential essay on that, his often referred to essay on that topic, is his piece that he wrote in 1875, which was only published posthumous after his death, is on truth and lie in an extra-moral sense. And I remember reading this essay, or actually reading a portion of that essay in class when we were used to teach our students about, nihilism and postmodernism. And very often this quote from the essay is something that we would come back to because it was quoted in one of the textbooks we used, where Nietzsche refers to truth as simply being a mobile army of metaphors, right? It's simply illusions whose origins we have forgotten, right? So he writes about that. Perhaps another quote from On the Genealogy of Morals, on morality, he writes, "There is only perspectival seeing, only a perspectival knowing. The more affects you are able to put into words about a thing, the more eyes, various eyes, we are able to for the same thing, the more complete will be our concept of the thing, our objectivity." And so this is actually very much like this typical illustration that people are using about, different people, blind people touching different aspects of an elephant, and everyone arriving in certain aspect or certain perspective about what this object might be, right? So this is kind of his idea, and I think many people, I suppose, would agree with that, and I agree with that. But Nietzsche actually pushes this to a deeper level. And his critique of truth really goes at least along two different trajectories. The first trajectory is that people prefer lies over truth. Like we find pleasure in lying over telling the truth. Because in order to lie, we need to be creative. We need to be able to invent things and juggle these balls, not forget what we have lied. And so that is actually something we like to do. The other argument that he has about truth is that we as human beings actually prefer illusions more than truth. We like to be lied to. We don't want to hear the truth, right? And we see this in life. It's an example I mentioned in the past of the friend. My wife has a friend, and this kind of my wife would challenge her. Well, try. Why don't you try this? And the friend then says, no, don't tell me this. I don't want to know, because then I need to change. So this preference, the will to illusion, the preference for illusion, is something that he talks about all the time. When all is considered, right, we prefer lies over truth, right? And people, as Nietzsche says, people don't want to hear the truth, as he puts it, because they don't want their illusions to be destroyed. Now, this proclivity and penchant for self-deception is something that has been explored in psychology and literature, and something that I will be coming back often. because this is so true about human existence, right? And people have picked up on this, and different psychologists, I don't want to go into that, but Nietzsche certainly made this point quite significantly. So I wanted to share something coming back to this notion, like why does he say that we prefer lies over truth? One is that we prefer the game of lying we find enticing, and I don't know if you find this argument convincing. The second is that we often prefer illusions over truth, right? We don't want to know. We prefer to be in the comfort of our illusions, right? That is why actually when people give us facts that challenge our eating habits, our political orientations, our belief commitments, we find this incredibly stressful, physiologically speaking. Right? So we don't want to be challenged. And that seems to be true, at least in some instances in life, right? But I'm really interested, in addition to these kind of two claims that he makes, it is actually another claim that is for me quite important. And it has to do with his low view, if I can put it that way, of human nature. In other words, his suspicion, his critique of our will to truth rests on an anthropological critique. In other words, Nietzsche asks the question, like, who are these human beings? Like, who are these human beings who go around and prattle about having truth and trying to articulate truth? Like, who are we who are doing that? And then he actually says that, given who we are, given actually how we behave on a daily basis, like, where is this will to truth coming from? For instance, he writes the following: the intellect as a means for the preservation of the individual unfolds its chief powers in simulation. So basically he's saying that what the human reason is doing essentially, the primary manifestation of the human reason and cognition, is basically simulation, is inventing stuff. It is fabulation, confabulation, right? That's what we are about. In man, this art of simulation reaches its peak. Here, deception, flattering, lying and cheating, talking behind the back, posing, living in borrowed splendor, being masked, the disguise of convention, acting a role before others and before oneself. In short, the constant fluttering around the single flame of vanity is so much the rule and the law that almost nothing is more incomprehensible than how an honest and pure urge for truth could make its appearance among men. So he continues, right? That the human beings are basically deeply immersed in illusions and dream images. Their eye glides only over the surface of things and sees forms. Their feeling nowhere lead into truth, but contents itself with the reception of stimuli, playing, as it were, a game of blind man's buff on the backs of things. So this was for me an insight, right? That Nietzsche's critique of truth actually rests on a particular understanding of human nature. Rests on the claim that however truth might be important, and I would argue actually the truth for Nietzsche is very important, because he is making it's one way of reading Nietzsche for sure, he is making very specific claims about what life should be and how we should realize ourselves. I mean, his vision of the human life is saturated with specific commendations and specific, I would say, truth claims, right? But he understands that the struggle for truth is more than simply the desire to articulate certain facts. The struggle for truth connects with having to deal with human nature which fundamentally undermines our ability to reach truth. And so nowadays, many people who are, Jonathan Haidt would be one of them, right? Who has shown, I believe, convincingly, and many other people have done this as well, have shown that people, when they are actually being exposed to facts, let's say from someone from a different political persuasion, they don't take these facts and say, oh wow, okay, let me now think, right? Let me now revise my view of, let's say, Biden, or let me now revise my views of Trump. No. By being exposed to facts, people actually become even more entrenched in their respective positions. So instead of an opening, actually a closure takes place. And so I think Nietzsche rightly asks us and challenges us to reflect on the underlying anthropological features of such willful ignorance, if I can put it in those terms. So that is why when I thought about this and read about this, and as someone who shares Nietzsche's suspicion about the clarity and transparency of human motivation, the clarity and purity of human intentionality, as someone who believes that the human heart is deceptive above everything, that we are driven by these affective and precognitive factors and urges of which we are often not aware of, when I approach it from that perspective, I really understand and agree with actually Nietzsche's critique of truth. So here are a couple of theses then, slowly wrapping up this episode on what I've learned from Nietzsche and how I was perhaps not so much impacted, but I found affirmation of some of my intuitions as I was reading him. So here's my first thesis, right? The first thesis is that the truth claims are often constructed to serve individual and collective interests. Now, Nietzsche said this. Certainly Michel Foucault, who is a kind of neo-Nietzschean, has articulated that. And I believe in this, and yet when I say that, I feel some shrinking back inside. I feel some reticence to affirm this, given the way that is being played out right now in American culture, right? That everything that people are saying is being simply read inevitably through such a prism, where people are resisting simple things such as masks and other issues because they're not able to hear them for what they are. They are hearing these things always distinctly ideologically. So basically I'm hesitant to use deconstruction because deconstruction actually means a different thing for people like Jacques Derrida, but kind of at least a popularized notion of deconstruction that postmodernism has, or some postmodernists have been promoting. That basically is our state of the day. I mean, that's how things are happening, right? We are deconstructing everything and not believing in anything. So I would not want this to be a permanent life posture, right? I don't want to be the kind of person who is stuck in an ideological echo chamber where no counterfactuals can ever lead me to revise my positions. I believe that's extremely dangerous, and this kind of epistemological nihilism is something that I certainly resist. But the basic intuition, the fact that truth claims are sometimes indeed constructed for such purposes, that when people are saying things, they're doing them with a certain agenda in mind. I mean, obviously, most of us would readily recognize that. And that is why Nietzsche is so deeply suspicious of systems, deeply suspicious of kind of closures, because very often they are being wielded with certain particular interests in mind. So that's thesis number one. Thesis number two is that something I said already, that for the sake of self-preservation, we actually prefer lies over truth. I mean, I believe that perspectivism tries to convey this essential idea, right? That we do very often prefer lies over truth. Anyone who has read, let's say, Dostoevsky's novels will see the novels being populated by characters who are engaging in such acts of self-deception and self-illusion. I'm thinking of Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment, who is telling himself stories about himself to himself, narrating certain rating his identity to himself, which is completely fictional when it comes to the motives of his crime, at least. So that is what I would certainly believe, and I certainly would consent that here Nietzsche has a specific point. And if anyone, when you read recent studies, a couple of years ago there was a study in a National Geographic, Why We Lie, the Science Behind Our Deceptive Ways, which actually confirms many of these philosophical positions that Nietzsche developed. And I would say that when you think about the Protestant Reformation, when you think about Martin Luther, that his basic critique of religion, which for him was the greatest adversary of true faith, like for him religion is often associated, the notion of religion that he critiques is associated with certain type of self-deception where people end up viewing themselves better than they actually are, and that's why they don't need God's grace, because they can actually fix their lives on their own. So that is present in Luther as well. So this is kind of an interesting point. So I agree totally with Nietzsche on that specific claim. And when you can think about, right, various aspects of how we deceive ourselves in life. Like there's this, which I found, I know this is kind of now more into circulation, this specific term, namely moral licensing. But I remember encountering that term first when I read Kelly McGonigal's book, The Willpower Instinct, where she shares this very interesting thing that happened when McDonald's introduced, I don't know how they called it, Mac salad or some salad options, that when they did so, that what actually happened was that the sale of cheeseburgers went up. And so people didn't know, like, why? Like, why is it now that we have a healthy option available there, that people are now buying more cheeseburgers? And then they came to the realization that what happened is that people, that once they saw that there was a healthy option on the menu, in their mind, they gave themselves the license then to buy a cheeseburger. So basically they acted as if they had actually eaten some salad and ordered some salad. Oh, this is a place that actually sells salads, and now I can actually buy myself a cheeseburger, with the implication somehow that either I deserve to eat this cheeseburger now, or that this cheeseburger cannot be as bad, given that this is a place that sells salads. And they've actually done these studies, kind of repeated them in different settings, where they ask people, do you want to give some money to charity in the future, the next couple of months, and people give a certain amount. And that commitment then gives people the license to splurge on themselves and go and buy some new clothes. I mean, just think about the mechanism that is involved there, right? And how that might actually function in the lives of believers who are going out and promoting these very high views of committed Christianity or committed religiosity, and then somehow giving themselves a license to engage in completely different actions, let's say during the week, right? How is this psychology of moral licensing enabling us to get off the hook when it comes to our religious practices? So I think all these mechanisms, I believe that Nietzsche rightly intuited that this is something that is going on. Okay, the thesis number 3. It is this idea that human nature, as I've stated before, character, habits, desires, affects, interests, passions, loyalties often get in the way of finding truth. Now, a couple of years ago, Giles Fraser had a series on Nietzsche in The Guardian. I think you can actually look it up. I think the title is Nietzsche Contra Dogma, and I was published in The Guardian on December 8, 2006. And he has this great insight about Nietzsche and his relationship to truth. And this is what he says. Nietzsche insists that truth requires first a training in truthfulness. That is to say, the search for truth cannot be simply the product of some machine that churns out truths once the mechanism has been properly set. In contrast, Nietzsche recalls us to the role of self-critical honesty in the search for truth. And that being fully honest means entering a complex and uneven terrain where influences, prejudices, doubts, histories, loves, emotions, politics, experience all jostle for a fair hearing. And there is not one systematic rationality that can easily accommodate that. And that reminds me, this is so true, right? That in order for us to be able to access truth, we not only need to have right information. Sometimes that's enough, but not always. And we don't only need to have the proper method, let's say like the scientific method, although very often that helps us come a long way. But that we also need to be different kind of people. Because imagine someone who reads the news or reads a holy book or pursues the search for a certain philosophy of life, let's say, and that person does not possess a minimum amount of integrity, teachability, openness, courage, sometimes even, right? Humility. If that person doesn't possess these kind of basic virtues, what is going to be the end result of that? The end result is going to be that we are going to be driven by personal interest, or we're going to be driven by fear, or by the fact that we will try something, end up in a more comfortable position rather than in a position that requires some self-sacrifice. So that is quite important, right? How very often the kind of beings we are preclude us from actually arriving at truth. Which then in turn, of course, reminds me of this beautiful statement in C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia, The Magician's Nephew, where Aslan, the figure Aslan, if you know the story, for those of you who know the story, you know that Uncle Andrew is this kind of really prototype of a manipulative and bad person who is unable to hear and to see the beauty of the new creation that is happening around him. And then the statement is made by Aslan that we only see, what we see basically depends on who we are and where we stand, right? Like what we see, what we're able to perceive, the truth that we are able to arrive at, deeply is implicated, on the one hand, on our frame of reference, like where we stand, on our worldview, on our commitments, like certain faith commitments, intellectual commitments, philosophical commitments will enable us to perceive things that are going to be more salient, will jump out at us because of our faith commitments. We will be able to notice certain things, perceive certain things, understand certain things based on this frame of reference. And then what you see depends on that, and it depends on who you are, the kind of person you are, right? And that is an important insight that I believe Nietzsche had. Now, Iris Murdoch, who is this just brilliant mind, 20th century philosopher and writer novelist who got Booker Prize, which is the UK version of the Pulitzer Prize here in the US, for her book The Sea, wrote a beautiful book that it's just a splendid reflection on ethics and metaphysics and morality and life, just great stuff, called Metaphysics as a Guide to Morals. And she writes that truth is not just a collection of facts. Truthfulness, the search for truth, for a closer connection between thought and reality, demands and effects, so demands and then effects, an exercise of virtues and a purification of desires. The ability, for instance, to think justly about what is evil, or to love another person unselfishly, involves a discipline of intellect and emotion. Thought, goodness, and reality, right, are thus seen to be connected. So this is really quite powerful, right? Where Iris Murdoch understands that a selfish person will simply see the world in a different way than an unselfish person. And certain things are going to be more prominent, they're going to be more salient, possibility for actions and interventions are going to become obvious and pressing in a way that they will not be for another person, right? And so who is selfish? And for me, that was kind of a very, very interesting idea. And we see this, I believe, one way actually to read Plato's famed cave analogy is to read it as this struggle of conversion in the effort to shed illusions about reality. Thesis number 4, this kind of idea of Nietzsche's perspectivism that I would like to suggest, perhaps, I think one way of trying to understand what he's trying to do. And this, I already implied this in what I said so far, is that the question about truth is not always about whether this fact is correct or this fact is not correct, but it has to do with potentialities and the meaning of truth. If you go back to the example that I gave just a moment ago about the selfish and the unselfish person, let's say both of these individuals perceive the need to alleviate, or let's step back. They see the facts about poverty, right? And they recognize them that there's a certain number of people in a certain neighborhood or part of the town that are really living in horrible conditions, right? They accept these facts, but their worldview and their state of character will lead them to completely different actions. If you believe, for instance, that poverty essentially is a result of irresponsibility, such as laziness or the failure to take, responsibility for your life, then that specific truth, the specific facts that you are perceiving, will not lead you to any meaningful action. So the potentiality of truth and the meaning of truth is thwarted because of your particular interpretation of the causes of poverty. On the other hand, the person who understands that poverty can come as a result of many different factors. Sometimes it is personal responsibility. More often than not, it has to do with broader sociological realities and economic realities. So let's say the person has that perspective, and at the same time, the person has a compassionate heart. The knowledge of the facts will lead completely different modalities of engagement. Not only will you be motivated to action, but you will start exploring possibilities of what can I do to alleviate the poverty in my neighborhood or in this particular part of town. And once you start engaging in that, certain new possibilities will open up. Like possibilities about vocational training or having soup kitchens or whatever you want to talk about, right? Whatever interventions you want to engage in, that your going along the way of action will actually open up new horizons of how that particular truth might actually unfold and realize itself. Now, I hope that makes sense, right? So very often, the pursuit of truth is not only simply about, can we have the right facts, but whether the truth can have its proper operations, whether certain facts can engender proper action. Well, that will depend on a host of other factors that go beyond simply the possession of facts. And I think also that's one way in which I read his perspectivism. And finally, as a Christian, I read his strong impulse against systems and finality and theory as an emphasis, as a defense of the particular and the contingent. I completely understand what he wants to say. I completely get it, because very often when people talk about worldviews and they talk about others, it is pursued in such a reductionistic way. Let's think, for example, like postmodernism. Like postmodernism doesn't exist. This is such an artificial term. Like we have many different postmodern thinkers who very often don't even accept that designation. But let's say we have postmodern thinkers who perhaps in different stages of their lives and in different places of their works are articulating certain positions. For instance, think about someone like Michel Foucault. Like Michel Foucault, the whole point of Michel Foucault is that he's constantly undermining what he said in some previous work. Right? It is very hard to say that Michel Foucault is a postmodern when there are actually many different Michel Foucaults and many different ways of reading him, even within a single work. So now to reduce Michel Foucault to a perspective, and then to put him along all many different postmodern thinkers, and then reduce all of that to a certain perspective, it might be helpful to provide us a certain orientation, right? To kind of a lay of the land, perhaps. But we have to use these reductionistic designations as heuristic devices, which can provide us with some sort of orientation, but which we then have to discard because they're fundamentally falsifying. And for me, that is quite important. This understanding that sometimes our talk about truth has this reductionistic quality to it and kind of minimizes or doesn't do proper justice to plurality. But even more importantly, it actually fails to give proper credence or proper understanding what it means to affirm the idea of creaturehood. And James K. Smith writes about this quite a bit in his book, Who's Afraid of Relativism? And he says, for instance, our epistemological desire to deny dependence and contingency amounts to a hubristic denial of our very creaturehood. And that bears all the marks of our transgression in the garden, kind of reference to Genesis 3. So, far from being the prerequisite for Christian orthodoxy, claims to absolute truth might be almost diabolical, because it is this idea of being like God or becoming like God, right? I want to be like God in the sense that I want to have this absolute truth that only God can have. He continues, it borders on idolatrous hubris for humans to claim absolute truth. Truth absolve a relation, truth that is independent, as their defense against relativism, by which they mean anything goism. We ought to reject anything goism, of course, but the alternative to anything goism is not some absolute standpoint. Just because we want to avoid arbitrariness doesn't mean we can excuse ourselves from contingency. Just because we eschew nihilism doesn't mean we get to avail ourselves of necessity. So these then are different ways in which Nietzsche has impacted me, the different kind of theses that I wanted to share, different ways in which his critique of truth has had an impact on me. The first one being that truth very often is about construction and production, that very often truth statements serve collective and individual interests. The second thesis is that very often we as human beings, we prefer illusions, we prefer lies over truth, and we gave some examples of that. I give some examples of that. Number 3, that very often human nature, character, habits, and desires get into the way of truth. I believe that is so absolutely correct, and we see this played out all the time in the Gospels, where the disciples simply, while having certain facts, don't understand the implications of the facts. And Jesus then calls them being hard-hearted and people who look but don't see and listen but don't hear. Thesis number 4 is that truth very often is not, the search for truth is not about finding the right facts, but understanding the truth as it is for me, as it is for our community, truth as it engenders and creates certain possibilities for action and ways of living. I think that is incredibly important. Thesis number 5, and I hope that my numbering before was correct, but so this is a good way for me to bring everything together. Thesis number 5 is that we have to be very leery of the critique of the particular, that very often that in the name of systems, we kind of let go of the particulars and the contingent. This kind of systematizing tendency has very often kind of a violent aspect to this because it tries to put everything together to a common denominator and doesn't properly recognize difference. And then number 6, and I don't think I mentioned this as a 6, but the number 6, I lumped it before with the previous thesis 5, but number 6 would be this notion that perspectivism interpreted in a certain way is not about this anything goes-ism, but about creaturehood. Yeah, so this is how I have journeyed with Nietzsche in this particular instance, and how I, as a Christian theologian and ethicist and someone who teaches philosophy, has been enriched, challenged, disturbed, very often had to react very strongly and have to react very strongly against Nietzsche. But within all of that, I've still been challenged and enriched by his reflection on this idea of the will to untruth that marks our lives. So thank you again for listening, for being willing to stay with me and to explore this aspect of Nietzsche's thought. And so until the next episode, I wish you to live truthfully, to stay courageous, and to live well. Goodbye.